and welcome everyone to the Berggren Forum. Just a couple of announcements. Next Thursday, February the 25th, there won't be a Berggren Forum, but at 5:30 p.m. there will be Alfred University's second annual Global Studies lecture. Steve Levitsky, Professor of Government at Harvard University, co-author of the widely read book, How Democracies Die, is the speaker, and the title of his talk will be Democracy After Trump. The next Berggren Forum will be on March the 4th. Jean Ellefson, Assistant Professor of Analytics in the College of Business, is the speaker, and her talk on March the 4th is titled In Quest of Inclusive Course Engagement. Today we're very excited to have outside Alfred University, Alex Sich. Alex is not a stranger to Alfred, though. He grew up here and graduated from Alfred Allman Central School a long time ago, studied nuclear engineering and physics as an undergraduate, and moved on to graduate studies at MIT in nuclear engineering. He's currently Professor of Physics at Kennesaw State University, and the title of his talk is a topic on which he's achieved considerable renown: Chernobyl Unknown Unknowns, what neither the Soviets nor the IAEA wanted anyone to know. So Alex, take it away.
Thank you very much, Emrys. For those of you who might remember, the reason I chose that title for my talk was, what was his name? Donald Rumsfeld's famous line on knowns and unknowns and things. So yeah, so again, thank you very much for the invitation. I appreciate that. What I'd like to do is spend about 15, hopefully not more than 20 minutes on what's called the active phase of the accident. And then we'll turn to questions. And then depending on the questions, I may go off dealing with the questions more robustly, or I may continue on with some other issues. All right, so it's very difficult, especially doing this virtually, to talk about Chernobyl, first of all, because of the venue. I have some slides that hopefully will turn out well, that will help people to visualize what happened. The other thing is that Chernobyl is just a massive, massive topic that has tentacles, so to speak, going off in all sorts of directions: cultural, political, scientific, engineering, reclamation, environmental. You can imagine it's just huge, huge, huge. So what do I mean by active phase? The active phase of the Chernobyl accident was the period of time from the destruction of Unit 4's core to approximately 9.5 to 10 days afterwards. During that 10-day period, there was very, very heavy contamination being ejected from the core. And on the 10th day, it rapidly dropped off by orders of magnitude. Okay, so that's, I know it's been what, 35, almost 36 years or whatever since the accident. So regarding your students, it was way before they were born. And I don't know what memories people have, but I think that one lingering memory that people have is one of the, what are called accident management actions taken, undertaken during a part of that 10-day period, and certainly lasting afterward. And that's the alleged dumping of materials from helicopters. Now, from that, I'm going to back up. Accident management actions are those actions that were undertaken by the Soviets to somehow suppress what was happening, either during the active phase, but mostly it turned out after the active phase. The problem is that when the Soviets presented their case to the world approximately 4 months later at the IAEA in Vienna, they knew at that time what actually happened, but they painted a completely different picture. What they said was that the bombing from the helicopters with various materials, and each of those materials had various functions, succeeded in smothering the core and saving the world from several things. One is a China syndrome, two is further releases, and so on. It turns out to be absolute nonsense. Okay. Now, I'm now thinking how long it would take to explain all this, but there's a timeline that, so part of my research revolved around what actually happened with the helicopters and other actions that were undertaken. And when I was at Chernobyl doing that research, virtually any source was open to me. There was no problem at all. Everything was open to me. So I managed to get my hands on some very interesting data and information on what happened. And it turns out, for example, that the bombing didn't start until past the halfway mark of those 10 days. The second unfortunate thing is that the bombing did not hit the core where things were burning, where the action was happening, so to speak. We know that for sure. Sometime before I arrived on the scene and sometime after the accident, there was even a video, which I have, of a Western commentator saying, now we know that no materials got into the core, but everyone denied it. The IAEA was vociferous in denying it because they believed the Soviet line. When I arrived at in the zone, a few months into my stint there, I was taken into a side room where they do video processing, and they showed to me frame by frame a picture of what was alleged to be and used by the Soviets to depict the burning core. When they took me through that frame by frame, because it's difficult to see with the flow of things, I said to them, wait a second, that glowing mass is not where the core is. I thought that the core was covered, and they kind of smiled to themselves and kept on saying, okay, do you recognize this structure? Do you recognize this area? And I said, but it's not. It's about 12 to 15 meters away from the core. It's on top of what's called the high bay area floor, and it's over what are called the spent fuel pools, which are very deep themselves. And then it dawned on me, right? Because then I started looking at the pictures, and it dawned on me that indeed the Soviets missed the mark. They never covered that core. And now everyone knows it. The OECD had buried a line in one of their reports, I think it was something like 12 or 15 years after, that admitted that nothing had gotten into the core. Now, I want to be very careful here, because that's not to take away from the heroism of the helicopter pilots. Those helicopter pilots indeed were heroic. Some of them paid with their lives, okay? But you have to imagine that helicopter pilots aren't nuclear engineers. They're certainly not architects, and they don't know the technical layout of the building. All they're told to do is hit the burning, glowing thing, whatever it is. And they did a remarkable job, right? They covered that area, but the area wasn't the core. Morris Rosen of the IAEA made a ridiculous statement saying that I flew over the core. I know that materials got in the core and the thing was completely covered. And it's nonsense. And I published that in I think it was I can't remember whether it was in my Boston Globe or Wall Street Journal op-ed piece, but it's in there, right? And never has it been challenged. None of the scientific findings have been challenged. So to this, now we know that the Soviets completely misled the world on what happened. And then in working with other people, we realized that significantly more material was released, although that wasn't part of my dissertation. My dissertation was just to recreate things. So that's one of the huge holes that has to be filled in history and in kind of accountability. The other thing that they undertook was to purge. They wanted to purge the core area with liquid nitrogen, and then realizing that couldn't happen because of the extreme temperatures there, that at least with nitrogen to suppress oxidation in that area. Well, that also didn't happen because the nitrogen arrived on site the day that the active phase ended. But they said that also succeeded. Another thing that they wanted to do was and they actually did, construct a heat exchanger underneath the foundations of the building because they were so concerned about a China syndrome. Now, we in the United States, and there's articles about this, right, that I studied, knew long before that a China syndrome was simply a bunch of nonsense that can never happen. Well, unfortunately, it took the Chernobyl accident to show that it's just absolute nonsense. And yet Hollywood makes its money on that kind of nonsense. Another thing that they wanted to do was to build something called a Casa Grande, a large house, which was basically an 8.4 kilometer wall 30 meters deep into the ground in order to stop surface contamination from getting into groundwater. Unfortunately, they stopped that work when it was about a quarter finished because they couldn't get into a very contaminated part of the exclusion zone at that point called the Red Forest. The Red Forest was a bunch of pines that had turned red because of the radiation. They weren't burned. What happened is the radiation slightly thickened the sap and those trees asphyxiated. It had nothing to do with burning from radiation. Anyway, they couldn't get in there because the levels of contamination was so horrendous that they stopped it. Unfortunately, the part of the wall that they created turned out to be a cup, if you look at it overhead. And that cup did stop groundwater flowing to the Pripyat River, which is right next to the plant. But it formed a cup kind of dam, and it actually raised the groundwater up to a point where it was above the lower foundation of where the turbine generators are. So what I'm telling you is that the Soviets, if they had done nothing, would have done less damage than what was done. And by the way, one of the things and I mean, we're thankful to this day that it didn't succeed. One of the materials that they wanted to bomb the reactor with was lead. Now, if they had actually managed to get lead into the core where it had melted, you would have had a catastrophic contamination of lead all over that area. Absolutely catastrophic. So I know that's a very quick thing that I've just gone over. I don't know how much time I've taken looking at this, about 10 or 12 minutes. What I'd like to do is just to show you a drawing looking down on top of the core, and then a side view to show you what's going on. So I'm going to try to share my screen, and let's see, it's right there. Okay, so I'm sharing. So hopefully everyone can see the, let me get to, let's see, where's the slideshow? There it is, current slide. So everyone should see the destruction after the accident. And if you look, I don't know if you can see can you see my cursor on the screen? Okay, good. So this is called the ventilation stack. To give you a sense of how big this building is, this roof right here is 75.5 meters above the ground, which is 3/4 of a football field, okay? The stack goes up another 75 meters. This is a tremendous facility. Reactor 4 was here, reactor 3 is here, 2 and 1 are up there, units 5 and 6, which were partially completed but then abandoned, are about a 1.5 kilometers away from here. And up here you can see a little bit of the cooling pond with the river feeding it. Anyway, this direction is to the west, this direction is to the north, and this is to the south. This building, which is about 800 meters long, houses 8 turbine generators all in a row servicing each of the reactors. Okay, so this just gives you a perspective of what happened. Now I'm going to quickly flow through these until I get to what I want to show you, which is this. All right. So today what we see, this is the core area where the core was, approximately 190.3 tons of uranium and approximately 2,500 tons of graphite. This thing is called the upper biological shield, or the Soviets have a nickname for it, Helen. Sorry, Mrs. Aldrich. This thing was flipped into the air by the power of the explosion, kind of did a somersault and landed and got stuck here. Why do we know that? Because pinning it are parts of the wall from the high bay area. So it must have been quite a distance up in the air. The core melted, and a lot of it is here. And then there's several layers of what are called a pressure suppression pool, which were filled with water that in the event of if you had one or two of the pipes break, that the pressure could be suppressed and the reactor wouldn't suffer damage. Well, pretty much all the pipes were sheared, and what you had was not a nuclear explosion. It was definitely not a nuclear explosion. It was a steam explosion. So it went from basically 70 atmospheres to ambient in the snap of the fingers. And that's why most of the top of the building was destroyed, because of the tremendous pressure waves that occurred. Now, these right here are what are called there's a north and a south version of the spent fuel pools, where old and burned fuel is contained for several years to cool before it goes off to another location. Here is the pile that the helicopters dropped, right? This is the pile. And if you look at some of the pictures, I'm going to take you through, this is what it looks like currently kind of drawn. So if I go through this and get the colors in, this is where the fuel is, right? Approximately 40 meters as the crow flies from just underneath the reactor to over to here. So why? So the question should be arising in your minds. How come there was a multiple orders of magnitude drop in releases on day 9.5 to 10? Because the reactor stopped itself. It wasn't even operating at that point, but what's called the decay heat, which is very ferocious after the reactor, was melting through a lower biological shield. And there's a pie-shaped thing that you can see here. It dropped to the floor, flowed along some pipes, and several things were happening. In chemistry, you learn about something called boiling point increase or freezing point suppression. That's one thing that was happening because the fuel was just taking up other materials in the way. The other thing was that it spread rapidly, so the surface area increased. And at the same time, the decay heat was going down. So it basically froze. That's what happened. It basically froze itself, and the damage is minimal. The damage is minimal. Here you have what's called a pressure distribution header, and you can see a chain hanging here where you have frozen fuel as stalactites. This flowed further down into other pipes, and there's virtually no damage, right? The melted fuel did virtually no damage. Okay, that's so unfortunately, it took this kind of an accident as a full-blown, and by the way, the uranium load in these reactors is significantly greater than what it is in Western reactors. No China syndrome. Impossible for a China syndrome. I mean, literally, physically, not because of man-made instrumentation or technology. Physically impossible for a China syndrome to happen. So these are stalactites. This is the famous elephant's foot. So they just froze. I mean, froze into this kind of goop. They call it Chernobylite because it's an interesting combination of various materials that were taken up. Okay, so I'm going to stop there and ask for questions.
Alex, could you
Yes.
just clarify what you mean by China syndrome? Not everyone would know that.
I'm sorry. So a China syndrome is this fallacious notion that if a nuclear reactor core fully melts, which it did at Chernobyl, that it would burrow down through the earth all the way to China. And a movie starring Jane Fonda was made precisely called the China syndrome.
I have a question then.
Sure.
What was the news going out inside the Soviet Union at that time? And were the announcements made within the Soviet Union different from the announcements made to the rest of the world?
Okay, so I'll start with the Swedish accounts and our small department meeting because I was in the doctoral program at MIT at that point. So the Swedes noticed that something was wrong. They had some of the people walking into their nuclear power plants were lightly, but nonetheless contaminated. And when they took a spectrum analysis, they realized that the only way you could get this kind of distribution of fission products was from an operating nuclear reactor. So they went crazy. They thought it was their reactor. They started looking around and they were dumbfounded because everything was fine. We positioned some of our satellites over. The accident happened in the middle of the night, Friday onto Saturday. Our department called a meeting on Monday, and by that time we had some satellite imagery and had pinpointed it to the Chernobyl plant. And sure enough, the satellites showed that there was a hot spot over Unit 4 or in Unit 4. So we knew that something very drastic had happened. In the Soviet Union, what happened was, I have it here on the slideshow, but unfortunately you can't hear the slides. I think they had the first mention to people was a brief account on their TV evening news, Vremya, which means time, just saying there was a mishap at the plant. People who suffered are being given assistance and measures are being undertaken to contain the accident. That's it. That's all they told them. People who were living in the town of Pripyat, which at that time was about 45,000 people, themselves didn't know except the nuclear engineers. They knew something drastic had happened. They weren't told. And there were women and children that went out onto a bridge that crosses a road that takes them to the plant, and they were getting fully contaminated by everything that was coming out. The people they didn't start the evacuation until 3.5 or so days after. And then they had 69 villages and the town of Chernobyl itself, which is 14 kilometers south, to evacuate. And that took many days to do. So people were contaminated horrendously. Villages were contaminated. There's actually two zones within. There's 2 zones, right? What's called the 30-kilometer exclusion zone, which has a 30-kilometer radius with a long tongue, so to speak, to the west because of the initial prevailing winds. And then they have an inner 10-kilometer zone, which is more jagged, and that's based on ground contamination levels of uranium-239, 240. The inner zone is never to be resettled. I lived in the outer zone the 1.5 years that I was there conducting my research, which is a whole very interesting story in and of itself. So I don't know if I answered your question.
Well, you could just follow up. At what point, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
At what point did the Soviet authorities sort of really announce publicly what had actually happened?
I can't remember right now, but my recollection is roughly a month to a month and a half, something like that. And then they bald-faced lied to the world at Vienna 4.5 months later. People knew, right? People knew because in Kiev, they held their May Day parade, like 4 days or whatever it is after. And they were running things, except Mr. Shcherbitsky, the head of the Ukrainian Communist Party, wasn't there because he knew. He was being informed by the Institute of Nuclear Physics, who were measuring the contamination on the streets of Kiev. Kiev is 120 kilometers south of Chernobyl. Now, it wasn't by any means deadly contamination, but they were running a full-blown, Kiev is a huge city, parade celebrating socialist labor and people were getting contaminated. People knew they were, the train stations were overwhelmed with parents throwing their children onto trains to get them out of the city, yada, yada. It was a mess.
Okay. A couple of people have put questions in the chat. The best thing is I'll read those questions. You can respond to them.
That's fine.
So Sandra Singer has asked, there is currently talk of increasing the use of nuclear power in this country. Any thoughts on this?
I'm a very big supporter of nuclear energy, but I'm not going to entertain that question because that's not what this forum is about.
You had done a report back in September.
Hang on, let me.
In the case of Daniel Fowler versus Shannon Keene quickly.
Try and mute someone.
Okay, you remember that.
Okay. Some authorities have denied the link between the accident and increased cancer rates in the area. What are your thoughts?
I'm sorry, Emrys, could you repeat that because some of the audio.
Some authorities have denied the link between the accident at Chernobyl and increased cancer rates in the area. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't know which authority they're talking about. Which authority? What do you mean by authority? Which authority has denied increased, for example, thyroid cancers?
Well,
it's nonsense. There's no authority figure or anyone that's a radiologist or radiation physicist or doctor or whatever that denies the link. Thyroid cancers spiked tremendously in children. Now, I'm not saying that's a good thing, but thyroid cancer is a fairly benign type of cancer that can be treated. What's very interesting is that we're not seeing what we saw in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We're not seeing cancers. Why? Because the spectrum of releases is very different. A nuclear reactor operates differently from a nuclear weapon, and the spectrum of fission products that are released are different. I'm not a radiobiologist, but it is very surprising that the incidence of leukemia are way suppressed compared to what we thought might happen.
Okay. Question from Gary Ostrauer. How well informed were the Moscow officials? Did the Chernobyl officials initially withhold information from Moscow?
Okay, that's a complicated question because of the cultural and political kind of backdrop or setting to all that thing. No, they did not know at the beginning. The plant manager himself literally simply could not believe, I mean, psychologically, he could not believe that there was an accident so bad that the entire core was exposed. So he didn't even report to the Soviet authorities what had happened. Part of it was there was this thought, there was this train of thought in the former Soviet Union that because large technologies based on Soviet, greatness, accidents couldn't happen. They literally had a phrase called "Avariy byt ne может." Accidents are impossible. If you start your technologies, designing them and building them with the assumption that accidents aren't going to happen, you will have an accident. You will have an accident. That is the worst form of or lack of safety culture imaginable. That's why we in the West design multiple layers of safety around our reactors, right? Like, for example, Fukushima, which was a very, very different accident from Chernobyl, right? Or TMI, pretty much, except for gases, were contained, right? Here, you had an entire core released. Well, what's one of the main barriers to releases? What's called a pressure vessel, right? We're talking for PWR, something that's 8 inches thick of steel. And TMI, everyone was worried at TMI 3 Mile Island that you'd have a China syndrome. Nonsense. The core partially melted and settled at the bottom of that vessel. That's kind of what happened at Fukushima. There was more releases at Fukushima, but you had 4 reactors that were involved.
The next question was actually from Samuel Cohen, which was, how does this compare to Fukushima?
Like a match compares to a grenade. mean, seriously, at Chernobyl, you had an explosion, not a nuclear explosion, a steam explosion from 70 atmospheres to ambient, right? That threw up the upper biological shield. That exposed the core at ferocious decay heat levels to start burning things in the area and sweeping stuff and wafting it up into the air. At Fukushima. So that's the other, sorry, I forgot to say, that's the other thing about Chernobyl. They didn't have a pressure vessel. They had no pressure vessel. Now, you can imagine I'm astounded and actually quite jaded at many Western experts making horrendous claims about, for example, Fukushima. Michio Kaku, who's a physicist whose area of specialty is string theory, got on TV, I have the video, and saying that the entire pressure vessel at Fukushima, at Chernobyl exploded. He doesn't know what he's talking about. There's no pressure vessel in an RBMK reactor. Lots of misinformation, lots of playing with numbers that people love to take advantage of, but simply aren't true.
Okay. Question from Jeff Slater-Beltrow. What are the best estimates of the long-term total human losses, lives lost and people incapacitated of the disaster at this point? Do these fall well short of Hiroshima and Nagasaki?
One of the problems, well, of course they're going to fall well short of Hiroshima and Nagasaki because those are completely different things. So as far as direct, immediate, or by immediate, I mean within several weeks deaths, I believe the current figure is 32. All right. Now, here's the problem. Another issue arises because in the former Soviet Union, there was no base upon which they had constructed enough information to know what things were in terms of radiation impacts on the environment, right? There was no base case because they thought that that accidents were impossible, right? So they didn't have a base case. Then when the accident happened, people scattered, people were evacuated, shifted as far away as they could be from the accident, literally over the 8 or 9 time zone former Soviet Union, and it became impossible to do good retrospective dosimetry. You would have to have all those people there, lots of equipment, lots of well-trained scientists measuring the effects for years and years and years. Where are those people? Then when the Soviet Union, thank God, broke apart, those people were now in different countries. They were in different countries. How do you get that information? Right? So unfortunately, it's extremely difficult to do. I'm not a radiobiologist. I'm not a radiation physicist by any means. I just know how difficult it is for these people. There's no one that can put a number on it. You can't do that kind of retrospective dosimetry.
Okay. Gary Ostrower asks, why did the IAEA not address with honesty the character of the disaster?
In my estimation, in my personal estimation, because the IAEA had many Russians working for them, and so there was internal momentum not to say everything. The other thing is, even I would suspect that the Russians at the IAEA themselves didn't know. It's Moscow that controlled everything. It's Moscow that brought their team to Vienna. Everything was very controlled. But the head of the Soviet delegation, Valery Legasov, said openly, I didn't I didn't lie, but I didn't say all the truth either. That poor man committed suicide 2 years after the accident, to the day, because of all the, because of everything the Soviet Union was, to put it bluntly.
What is Chernobyl? Oh, sorry, there's another question from Sandra Singer. Could you tell us more about your experiences living there? And I was going to ask whether you yourself risked contamination in going where you went.
So lots of myths to dispel there. First of all, yes, of course, the town of Chernobyl, which is located 14.5 kilometers almost directly south of the plant, was contaminated. Very good professor of physics at Harvard University, and who unfortunately has passed away, Dr. Wilson, gave me a dosimeter to take on my adventures, right? So I was living in this cottage in the town of Chernobyl, and I was walking around the zone and checking stuff out, and it was absolutely phenomenal. I mean, people may think I'm morbid, but it was like a nuclear engineer's dream laboratory, right? Because
Alex,
I
could you say what a dosimeter is, please?
So a dosimeter is basically a radiation detector. There's various kinds. I'm not going to get into that detail, right? So I was able to walk around and ascertain, measure, whatever, kind of map out things. So it was awesome. The things that I learned, right, at the university, I was there to actually experience, right? If you have a dosimeter, for example, and you raise it higher, you get a higher dose. Why? Because the planar surface is greater and you get more effect. So I would go up to telephone poles and trees, and I would scan around, and on one side there was more contamination than on the other. Why? Because you have the shadow of the prevailing winds on those structures. If you go to houses there and you, beneath the roofs where rain would drip down, you have contaminated lines, right? Because the rain would wash up some of the contamination by the houses. If you go to large fields where you have long lines of trees as fire breaks, you knew where the prevailing winds were, right? Because the prevailing winds would go over the trees, they'd pause a little bit because there's a pressure drop, swirl around a little bit, and then that little minute time that there was swirling before going on, it would drop some of the contamination on one side. So I'd be walking on one side and on the other side and getting different readings, right? Another thing was that the town of Pripyat, which at that, I think I said its population was 45,000, we used to go there at nights after work to go to the sauna and to go to the swimming pool, which was still operating there, right? I hold the American record for the 100-meter freestyle in that pool just because I'm the only American that swam that event. So it's kind of, that kind of interesting stuff happened. But why would the people go there? Because they'd scavenge for good furniture, right? The scientists would go there and scavenge for good furniture. They'd bring it back to their flats in Chernobyl and they would live. Well, I took my dosimeter and I started scanning the sofa that they brought me, right? And I found a hot spot on that sofa. So I could just kind of there were two. I conveniently cut them out and I used the sofa, right? Now, I'm not trying to make light of this. It's not a joke, okay? And by the way, 60 Minutes did a thing on me and my Russian advisor at that point, and they flipped up the little blanket that I had on my sofa, and they called it the Swiss cheese sofa because parts were taken out of it. I mean, it was kind of hilarious, but not, right? No, I was fine. The background radiation in the town of Chernobyl when I was there was approximately 1.5 to 2 times what normal background radiation was prior to the accident, which means Boulder, Colorado is getting pretty much equivalent or more because of its proximity to cosmic rays and the granite in the mountains, which contains uranium.
What is Chernobyl like now?
Zoological wonderland. I mean, when I was there, also funny stories, right? When I was there, just after actually it's very sad because just after the accident, when the trucks were running 24/7, they were animals that lived close to the ground, let's say voles or foxes or dogs or whatever, would go blind because of the intense contamination. One of the first things would be blindness. So they'd walk into this, 24/7 caravan of material carrying trucks and just be, killed. Then there were troops sent out to kill as many animals as they could. There are moose there, there's boar there. I saw them, right, when I was there. But you can imagine what we call March Madness was like there, right? You're talking March when all the animals are getting frisky. But when I was there, there's no one there to hunt them, right? People just left those animals alone. Well, you can't sleep at night in like the real wildlife because those animals are going ballistic at nights, chasing each other and frolicking and having a good time, right? So it was an ecological garden. You could not tell unless you had a dosimeter that you were in a contaminated zone. It was wonderful.
There's
This
a question.
already started, Jerry. I must have gotten the times wrong.
There's a question from Susan Steerer. How far from the today?
Hey, Emrys, the audio went down a bit.
Oh.
Go ahead.
How far from the plant? Sorry, not sure. Do you want to?
I can hear you.
Okay. How far from the plant must people stay away today?
Oh, so the exclusion zone itself, the outer 30-kilometer exclusion zone. Oh, hello, the cartilages, a shout out. So I'm sorry, I had to say that. So the 30-kilometer zone is the one that keeps, so to speak, people out, even though there were old people who were shocked by the whole thing, who jumped the fence, so to speak, and went back to live in their old homes. So the workers who tend to the zone, like the scientific group to which I was assigned, lived in the town of Chernobyl, which was outside the 10-kilometer fully exclusion zone, but within the 30-kilometer zone. So there's work going on inside the zone all the time. Now, outside the zone, there's various what they call zones of contamination. And each level is defined by some planar density of whatever radioisotope that you're talking about, and they go out from 5 to 1, I believe. Okay, so if I recall the question correctly, how far do you keep away? Well, you can drive right up to the Chernobyl exclusion zone if you want. You can't get in without a pass, but you can certainly drive up to it.
We're beginning to run out of time, but there's two more questions.
Okay.
One from Dave Toot. Are there many similar reactors operating these days?
Unfortunately, yes. That's part of the issue with the Russian Federation. The RBMK reactor is their homegrown reactor, so they have this pride of design and ownership of that design and the construction. So you have, I believe today, there are still 12 operating RBMKs. I may be wrong, plus or minus one, but something like that. I'd need to check. The ones in Lithuania were shut down a number of years ago. All the ones in Ukraine were shut down, but the Russians continue to operate theirs. Now they claim, and they have made safety improvements, but that does not. There's nothing they can do about the fact that they don't have either a containment building over the reactor, nor do they have a pressure vessel surrounding the reactor. Those reactors continue to operate to this day. And, you know, many of us have been making calls to the Russian Federation. You've got other designs, use those, but stop using these. They're not going to do that.
Okay. Quickly then, because we are running out of time, but Susan Steer has two more questions. Did the government help people to relocate? And to clarify this, do you think that this kind of accident could not occur in this country because of our safety requirements? So
it could not. I'll be very flat out about it. It could not happen. It could not happen in the West, period, not just in our country. Second thing is, yes, the government did move people, but let's say I focus just on the ones that were living in the zone at the time of the accident. You have to imagine this is 69 villages, right? This is rural Ukraine, 69 villages. It's basically farming country, dairy country, right? So these peasants, because that's basically what they were. I'm not trying to be derogatory where I'm saying it, but they're villagers on the level of peasants, right? Were ripped out of their homes. They didn't have, you can't explain to a peasant or a villager what a nuclear reactor is, let alone an accident. So they just got ripped out of their homes. They were given new apartments in cities, and a lot of them started failing in their health, not because of the radiation, but because psychologically they were so impacted. I mentioned before that a good number of these people jumped the fence and started reclaiming their cottages back in the zone. At first, the police caught them and threw them out, right? But after repeated attempts, there was no way to stop them. So the medical authorities in Ukraine said, look, these people are older. Radiation doesn't affect them as much as it does, say, a child in the womb, right? Or younger people or whatever, right? So if we can't make them stay out of their homes, let's just monitor them, right? And so they just started monitoring them. And I was eating lunch with these people all the time. I visited them at their cottages all the time. They were wonderful people. One of the silliest, most embarrassing things that happened to me in the zone was when we were eating lunch at the workers' cafeteria. I saw some of these villagers come up and scoop up food from the food that people were throwing out, right? And I was like, oh my gosh, these people in the villages have nothing to eat. Well, the workers started laughing at me and they said, they got so much to eat, they don't know what to do with it. What they're taking is food for the slop troughs for their pigs, right? So, I mean, they were doing great.
Okay. Well, Alex, it's gone past 1 now, and
Yeah,
you've
I'm
answered
sorry.
a lot of questions. So I would like to thank you for sharing your experiences and your expertise on
Sure,
obviously
I'm
a
happy to.
tremendously important issue. And so just thank you very much for a really, really interesting presentation and discussion.
Yeah, sure, no worries. Thank you very much for having me.